Hi, everybody. Wow, what a nice venue here. I used to play in clubs and bars, and I never thought about being on stage of such a nice theater. And now I am, without guitar. But I have to talk to give on CSS preprocessors for the best of the both worlds, which includes 3 question marks, this title. You see them? By the way, I'm G16N on Twitter. First question mark, what is a CSS preprocessor? Well, let me show you. A CSS preprocessor is a thing where you put some stuff in. Then there's some processing, which takes a while. And if you're lucky, the output will be kind of, guys in the front rows tell those in the back. You see it? Exactly. Well, I have a camera showing this. That's the output. All right. What are those both worlds? Well, that's heaven and hell. And what's the best? Is there anything good you can take out of hell? I hope that will answer this talk. I got the impression you love those coffee grinders, so I made up a web shop. And the markup for that should looks like that. There's a product list, and we have an item in there with an image, brand, model, description, price, and blah, and a button to buy this thing. Okay, and then once you picked one up, oh, that's a styling for that with these classes, okay? And then you get to the checkout, and you will have a product list again, which might look like this, because it appears differently. And so you have different classes prefixed with checkout. So, styled with another set of classes. So question is that a good thing to do? Because we're using different markup for the same thing, for a list of products. Well, we might use actually the same markup for those products without prefixing product overview or a checkout, and have in the checkout the same markup again, without the button, obviously, and just the ID of the page changes. And that way you can style both lists differently with the ID of the page, depending on that. Okay, keep that in mind. We're coming back to that. With CSS preprocessors, you can bring it in a nice readable form using nesting. The CSS preprocessor generates from this exactly what we've seen before. And the same for the checkout thing. And now you can even put those rules for the overview page and the checkout into different files and include them into your style sheet. With this underscore, the CSS preprocessor does not create a special file, CSS file for that, but includes it into one CSS file, which is important for page speed, that you download just one resource for styling. And that way you can do some modularization. You can have one file where you just define all your colors, and one file for typography, some helper things like image replacement or clearfix or whatever. And that way you can also implement atomic web design introduced by Brett Frost, where you go from small things like a button or a text input field to bigger things like a field set and a form, and then eventually the final web page. Well, did you notice how good this slide of Brett's fits into my presentation? I think Let me show. Yeah, he uses the same typeface. I think everybody nowadays loves League Gothic. So it's becoming a bit boring. I might change. Okay, look man, no classes. When you use semantic markup like schema.org, the vocabulary here written in RDFA light syntax, I'm not going about that shit, whether the struggle between Hixie and the W3C here about that. There are no classes anymore. It's just in this markup you would need to make this web page readable for machines like search engines. Google would like that. Or other search engines like DuckDuckGo or whatever. Yeah, and you can even use those things for styling with attribute selectors. So you don't need any classes anymore for the purpose if you just use this semantic markup where you describe what is on the page and not how this should be, how this should appear, how this should be styled. That you do in the style sheet. And you can do it for the product overview page and for the checkout page again. Okay, let's do some break here. And have one more cup of coffee. Now, some designer might be, it's a good idea to have this heading all in uppercase. So you might put a class here and a declaration, uppercase, text transform, uppercase. And it's uppercase or lowercase. With another rule, it works. Or in Italian, un'altra tazza di caffè, per favore. That's all my Italian. Or lowercase. Or German. Noch ein Tässchen Kaffee, bitte. Or lowercase. Except that this is wrong. Because in German language, you spell nouns with as a capital letter, as in a source code. So what might look like a good idea of the designer might appear to German readers as a spelling mistake. So you would not do this text transform for German language. Okay, you can do that with that rule. For German language, don't do this text transform. But this is wrong. Why? Because, where is it? Whoops, that's wrong. Yeah, here. Here in the markup, it says lowercase, but it does not appear in lowercase. So it's a mismatch. So presentational markup is from hell. It should be like this. You can style the heading and then say, okay, in German, you don't do the text transform for headings. Works fine. And you don't need those classes anymore. Go, another language. Okay, that's Klingon. For Klingon language, you should not do any uppercase nor lowercase because Klingon is written in uppercase and lowercase letters which have different meanings. And one of the bad tricks of Mark Okrand, who invented this, is actually using a small l and a capital I. Anyway, you don't text transform for Klingon language, and that's what I wanted to show you. You always will do this, or rather you won't do this, text transform for any element in Klingon language. So this is an example where important rule makes sense. So if anybody tells you don't use important never ever, he's wrong. This is such one case. Keep that in mind. We're getting back to that right now. This is a real world example You see, Klingon language is not very used today. We still have some years till the first contact. But this is a real-world example that happened at my work. There was some element with a class hidden. And the rule in the style sheet, hidden, display none. Okay. I thought it would be a good idea to always have display none for hidden elements. So I added important. And the application didn't work anymore. Why? Some JavaScript developers thought it was a good idea to say, this element, show, which translates to changing the display property to block. Now look at this. You have an element with a class hidden, which is shown on screen. It should be shown. It doesn't make any sense. So this is code from hell. You should do it this way with JavaScript. Remove that class. Or even without classes. With a hidden attribute in HTML. Which should also be better for accessibility. Because screen readers would notice the change of the hidden state. They might not take notice of changes of the styling. So just remove, and you don't need any CSS here. Well, except for older browsers, but for them you can put up a rule into this. This leads us to this. This is wrong. This is the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript go into each other. But they should be apart. Oops. So the separation of concerns. It's rather not this, but also this. Yeah. No connection here. Don't change CSS properties with JavaScript. Just change the DOM, and then other rules apply to those elements. That would be heaven. Okay, back to our shop. Once we ordered one of those coffee grinders, and at the end of the process you have, I'd say, 3 buttons. But you want to have the user click on that one. That's a call to action. You don't want him to leave the checkout or something. You want him to order. So you might style the order button different from the other ones. Bigger, a different color. Okay, let's do that. You might do that with classes. That would be the OOCSS approach. Have some classes like button, a large button, red button, or small button, black button. Okay? And have the declarations for all those classes in a style sheet. So, what's this object-oriented CSS about? It's about objects which are repeating visual patterns, not logical, visual, which can be extracted into independent snippets. Okay, blah blah. The goal is reusable code, maintainability, performance. Sounds good. And doing this by using only class selectors, no element type selectors, no ID selectors, just class selectors, no combinators. It means no dependency from parent elements, and have all those classes in the markup. Okay. So this is what this does is a connection from these objects, these reused patterns, via class selectors to the styling. And then you have those elements, and with class attributes you make the connection from this button to button, large button, red button. Okay, from this button to small button and black button. This one also. Yep. And these things are sometimes referred to as CSS classes. And it is code from hell. Why? Because it's presentational markup. So it might look like that in the end. And all those classes blow up your markup. And why should each element with each sibling have the same classes? Doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway, Nicole said OOCSS is about pure CSS, which is true, but it's about shitty HTML. Or as Mark Norman Francis put it, OOCSS is an abbreviation for obstinate overuse of classes and style sheets. CSS classes is a term from hell, because there's no such thing as CSS classes. Classes are a construct in HTML, which might be used by CSS class selectors. Yeah, but there are no CSS classes. If you say CSS classes, you mean presentational markup. So, let's look at this again. Only class selectors. Well, I guess no. No element type selectors. Why not? Why should I say, well, should I give a button a class button? It's already in the markup, in the type of this element that this is a button, or an li element. It does not need a class list item. No, it's already a list item because it's an li element. No ID element, no ID selectors. Well, I say I wouldn't consider this as a guideline. It's a mantra of a sect. So which S in CSS stands for Scientology. So ID selectors do make sense. So the pros of OOCSS might be reusable code units. That's what they're aiming at. You will have a smaller CSS file, okay? Selector specificity is not a thing because all those class selectors have the same specificity. Obviously, if you use only one class. Selector performance, yeah, if you only have one selector and not compound selectors, it would be more performant. Okay. But you have presentational markup, and you have bigger HTML files with all those classes in it. And you have one style sheet, which you throw over to the client once, and then it's in the cache. But you have several HTML files, maybe for your website. So why do so many prioritize a few bytes of extra CSS over any other performance concern? Who brainwashed them? The CSS BEM what the fuck movement. People trade small CSS for large HTML. World is upside down. So this is not this argument is just null and void with a file size, because HTML is you have more HTML files and this counts more. Specificity, I would say specificity is not your enemy, it's your ally. So if you use specificity wisely, it's your friend. So this is not an issue either. Selector performance, I have never seen a browser freeze up because of CSS selectors. If that is a bottleneck, no, that's never the bottleneck, I think. The bottleneck, maybe you have too much elements in your DOM, but not this one. So things actually have a noticeable impact on users. Optimizing CSS selectors, Writing semantic markup, Okay, so the benefit of OCSS is reusable code units. And it's true. But can we get those reusable code units out of the hell? Can we take the good out of the hell? Let's try it. We just have to shift that line. We have to get those things into the style sheet. And that's where preprocessors can help. For instance, and you will heavenly markup. But how can we do that? With mixins. Mixin, you just change this to mixins, those reusable units. And then let's look at the heavenly markup again. Okay, the submit button should get button, button large, button red. Okay, these connections. The other buttons should get button, button small, button black. Okay, these ones. Thank you, markup. And then you just include the mix-ins. And you will have a clean markup with no classes anymore. And this generated CSS. And you see that this code will be repeated, which is not what we would want to have, especially if we would include some image here in a data URL. So can we do better? Yes, we can with extends. So we get back to our original classes and just say extend those classes. And extend does this. It puts those selectors in the line of those classes. This will be the generated CSS. So you don't have the declarations repeated, but the selectors, which should produce smaller CSS. We still have clean markup, even though we have those classes in the style sheet. Here, those. We don't use them in the HTML. If we don't use them in the HTML, why having them in the style sheet? Doesn't make any sense as well. So we can do even better in Sass since version 3.2, where placeholders were included. You saw the change? We just change the dot to a percent sign. Do the same. And it produces this, not this this CSS, but this. Those placeholder names will not be in the style sheet, in the CSS that's been generated. So it looks like this. And that's what we want. So what are we doing is we have an intermediate layer with those reusable objects between the markup and the generated CSS. That means that when we do changes in a style sheet, we don't have to touch the HTML. We don't have to change any classes here, which might be important because HTML is not always done by the front-end developer. HTML is often generated by the back-end. And you don't want to have those back-end guys changing their code in order to change the appearance. So that's what Jens Meyer always says, markup changes are expensive. Instead, when you want to change the appearance of your elements, you just change your Sass code. What if we don't want to have the buttons on some other page look the same as the ones on our checkout page? Well, you can prefix it with a page ID. And on some other page, you can have another submit button, which is also red, but not large, but small, making these connections. So. Or you can give those buttons IDs. And when I did this recently, the QA guys, quality assurance, heard about those guys? They came up to me and hugged me and they kissed me and no, they didn't do that. But they loved me. Because IDs are good for automated testing. They can really use them when they want to simulate some click on some element. They love those IDs. That's code from heaven. And instead of those element selectors, you can use those IDs and make those connections here. So sometimes you have to decide, do I want to have a mix-in or an extend? Because you cannot use extends everywhere in your style sheet. You cannot use extends in media queries, for instance. What I'm usually doing is this. I use mix-ins and extends. I just declare a mix-in and reuse it for the placeholder by the same name. So I have it both ways. I can use it as a mix-in and I can use it as an extent of the placeholder. How does it work together with frameworks like Bootstrap? Well, should you use Bootstrap at all? Who loves Bootstrap? Show of hands? Not many. Like Jens Meyer said, a framework will always get you a suit like out of the store. We'll never get a tailored suit with a framework. Yeah, Bootstrap is somehow for developers without heart. Sounds good. Oh, I like this one by I think Peter Gunnar. Bootstrap is the IKEA of web development. Anyway, if you have to use Bootstrap, I don't envy you. You might still use that approach. You might still extend those Bootstrap classes. You don't have to use them in your HTML code. Oh, but you still will have all those classes in your style sheet if you do it, of course. Well, overkill. Well, anyway. We've seen that nesting can make your code more readable. Modularization makes your code better structured. And CSS preprocessors like Sass will help you to get all that CSS objects, all those repeating units out of the HTML there where it belongs to, into the style sheet, using mix-ins or extends and placeholders. And Ian Storm Taylor, I think, was it who coined the term OOCSS for that. When I first heard it, I sat there and thought, yeah, that's what I'm doing. Will you do? So, the takeaways. Presentational markup is hell. Separation of concerns is heaven. And you can get the best of both worlds of it by shifting that line, by having those things in the style sheet, not in the markup. So, why should one use Sass and OOCSS when Sass gives the opportunity to have both good CSS code and good HTML code? My answer to that is you shouldn't use OOCSS, you should use OOCSS. So, which side are you on? Mille grazie.